A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
So many of us will be aware of the changes that are impacting our children's education in schools. You might recall just recently a mother in South Australia removed her 3 children from a Riverland government school where her children allegedly learned about bestiality in a relationships class. Well, David de Lima is the South Australian State Director for Family Voice Australia. He's been monitoring those developments. David, welcome along to 2020.
Well, thanks for having me, Neil.
David, some will be taken aback. They won't believe that children are being taught about bestiality in schools, in this case a Year 9 class. What sort of reactions have you been receiving as you've talked about this amongst people in South Australia?
Neil, it really has provoked outrage, but not enough. The situation is as follows. It was a school in the Riverland area of South Australia, that's Renmark High School. A Year 9 class of girls was to be given relationships enrichment. Incredibly, no teacher was present at the time. It was a guest speaker who spoke in a very negative way. He was swearing, showing inappropriate pictures. Some of the girls were so appalled and really wounded by what he was saying that they asked to be excused to go to the toilet and they didn't come back to class. And so the content was really very, very inappropriate for those children. And it also occurred, Neil, without parental consent. So at many layers, there's been tremendous concern about what happened there.
Let's talk about the parents for a moment. Was this South Australian mother, named Nikki Gaylard, was she right to take her daughter out of the class and even out of the school? What are your thoughts, David?
Well, it means that she has no confidence in the school, and that's a real problem for the institution because things go wrong and life's got to go on, and we've got to say sorry for what's happened, and that has occurred. And I doubt that this problem is going to occur in the same problem too soon. But nevertheless, the school really has some soul searching to do in relation to how it's connecting with families and the extent to which they can receive an apology and be restored. So we would hope that would be the case. The individual who gave the class has now been suspended from doing such things in state schools. Now, we need to go a lot further than this, but whether she was right or wrong is a valid judgment for her to make. I can well appreciate that she was so outraged that she just couldn't stand the thought of her kids ever returning to the school, but time will tell on that.
I mean, there are challenges in state-run education. I wonder your thoughts here. Is it this sort of thing that seems to be fueling the movement of parents from government schools to private schools? Is that something you think is just causing a reaction?
Yeah, I think that is part of it because certainly many parents are not happy with what's going on in the state system. But I hasten to add, Neil, and I'm really sorry to say this, but it is the truth, that some of our private schools are also going down the pathway of this relationships enrichment program whereby diversity is being, shall we say, applauded instead of challenged. Because Jesus said, as we know, that in the beginning God made them male and female. And so the gender confusion which seems to be enveloping society is not only being espoused in government schools, but in some independent schools as well.
Okay, so it doesn't matter what school your child is in, you've got to be diligent as a parent. The children, in this case, not told in advance that they would be learning such things. Parents, often intentionally, as we've been talking about for some years now, being kept in the dark. Is there something here parents ought to be doing to demand a little more transparency or a little bit more notice when these sorts of things are coming up?
Absolutely. And this is a principle that should apply both to independent and to government schools because in both cases they are providing a service on behalf of parents and they operate in what historically we've called the place of parents, to use the famous Latin phrase in loco parentis, in the location or in the place of the parents. And many schools seem to lose sight of that, particularly the government ones. And so what parents need to do is to reclaim their God-given responsibility and right to educate. Now, you can outsource the function of educating children, but you can't outsource the responsibility. That must remain with parents. But Neil, I'm so disappointed to say and to think that if you ask most people, and this is true even of many Christians, whose responsibility is it for the education of children, they'll invariably say the government. Well, God hasn't given children to governments, he's given them to parents. And so even in the Christian community, we need to reclaim the recognition that parents are responsible for the education of their children.
Okay, parents responsible, and if you don't take that responsibility seriously, the likelihood is that the school that you send your children to may well bring in a third-party presenter. In this case, as you say, I think you said they've been suspended, but in the case of where things are at right now, so far as these relationship courses go, do you think that these are likely to be some form of activists who are a part of these third-party presentations?
Well, unfortunately, what is fully accepted and fully endorsed in our state schools, and increasingly it's the case in some private schools, is what I call the queer agenda. And I'm talking about a global movement towards accepting something that traditionally we've recognised as both not in accord with the Christian worldview, and it's not even in accord with nature. And I'm speaking of all the variations on the natural family. So now, I'm not speaking in a judgmental way here to people who are genuinely confused about sexual identity and gender and so on. We recognise that people live in a confused world, and we want to help such people, but we don't help them by saying that it is fine and okay to get involved with people of the same gender, or whether it's the issue of cross-dressing, or whether it's transgenderism, and all of these aberrations. We want to work pastorally and to encourage people who are genuinely confused, but we don't want our children to be indoctrinated. We don't want them to be told that if you decide that you would like to change your gender, absolutely go for it. We don't want that. So we need to recognise that the schools have become targeted by this agenda, and we need to resist it.
So you have state-run relationship programs, and almost to the point where you would say, and maybe this is being too generous, but fueling the confusion. It was reported that the first slide shown to that class of Year 9 school girls said the words, "You can see queerly now." I'll say that again, you can see queerly now, not clearly, queerly. We're most familiar with those initials these days, LGBTQI, but there's something that now people perhaps are becoming a little bit more concerned about. It's that plus on the end, LGBTQI plus. Are we seeing what that plus means, including bestiality? Thoughts here?
Well, it's true, and we don't like to think about seeing such things, but it wasn't that long ago in Queensland that a fellow gathered friends and family in the park and married his Labrador. It's hard to believe. I mean, that's not a legally recognised relationship, but he felt the need, with the approval of family and friends, to express his covenant love for his dog. Now, where do you go from there? It's just bizarre what's happening to our society. We need to just get back to reality here and recognise that both Scripture and nature, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, smile upon heterosexual relationships. It is from male and female that we have the natural issue of the next generation. So nature itself smiles upon the complementary relationship between male and female.
It certainly
restore that.
It certainly demonstrates, doesn't it, how much has been lost since the definition of marriage changed back in 2017. And now you get the plus factor. And we hear about students being taught about bestiality. And we might even ask, is that even legal to teach children about that? It certainly appears to me it's illegal for that activity to happen. So the fact that it can even be talked about, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that is one of many very delicate subjects that I think it's best to leave with parents. Often as a teacher over years, particularly when I was a teacher full-time many years ago, there were one or two curly questions that kids would answer, and I would say, just check with your parents on that one, because the matter is too sensitive for general discussion in the classroom. I mean, it's one thing to talk about such things as bestiality. The action is illegal, but talking about it is most unfortunate for young innocent ears to deal with. So I think best for parents to handle that. And this goes back to the whole question of the lack of consent which occurred in the Riverland situation. The parents didn't know in advance what was going to be happening. And you always should check in advance with parents. If there's any uncertainty about whether a lesson is age appropriate or whatever it might be, check in advance. And so the school made that fundamental error. It's because the school, as is the case in so many schools, have forgotten that they are in the place of parents in loco parentis, and they provide a service on behalf of parents. They should make sure that the parents, who are their customers, after all, taxpayers and fee payers in private schools, they are the ones that they've got to make sure are satisfied and pleased with what's going on.
And because Christian parents have a sound definition around sexuality and relationships, a biblical definition, we can perhaps more easily discern when there are damaging perspectives being introduced to our children. Why is it, you think, David, that so many Aussies seem to be missing that?
Well, Christians are not immune from this process of assimilation, and when the law changes, our thinking changes, regrettably. So we need to sharpen up. We need to be led by the Spirit of God. We need to make sure that the law of God is written in our hearts, even if faulty laws are written in the legislature. And it doesn't help when we have, as you've indicated recently, in recent years anyway, passed the amendment to the Marriage Act to include same-sex relationships. The only reason Parliament could do that is because the High Court made a ruling that the Parliament could impute to the word marriage any meaning that it chose. That's just an astonishing determination. And they went further, I'm sorry to say, with all due respect to the High Court justices, but they said that it could even include polygamy. So when the very courts of our nation are providing that kind of advice, which is really defying, I think, what the founders of the Constitution meant when they used the word marriage. After all, it did have a meaning in the dictionary. Why should that change now? So we're living in an entire culture of relativism where things are what you want them to be or what you feel them to be. Our churches are not immune from this, and we need a reformation in society, yes, but it's got to start with the church.
It's got to start with the church, and there might be a warning sound for parents. David de Lima is the South Australian State Director for Family Voice Australia, and no doubt you'll find resources on the Family Voice website where there are articles and there are campaigns around these sorts of issues. I'll encourage listeners. familyvoice.org.au is the website, familyvoice.org.au. David de Lima, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today on 2020.
Well, thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.